As most of you, or many of you, will have seen from the notice I put on my community page, yesterday I was unable to do a program because the night before I was unfortunately had a recurrence of illness from the virus I have been suffering from, and my voice had gone. I was unable to speak at all except in a soft whisper. This morning, my voice has returned, as you can see, but it is not perhaps 100% there. And it may be that over the course of this program, there will be stumbles and such things. And if so, my apologies. But anyway, let's get on and consider the events of the last 48 hours since I did my last program, because a lot of very dramatic and important things have taken place over this period. Now, had I actually managed to do my program yesterday, I would have introduced it by saying that there was reason to think that the Israeli attack on Iran was about to take place, and the reason was that there were reports coming in of a large-scale redeployment of US air refueling aircraft to the Middle East. And in fact, a short time later, confirmation came that the Israeli attack on Iran, the one that we have been expecting now for several weeks, ever since the Iranian attack on Israel of 1st October, anyway, that attack has now happened. And I think that before I proceed to discuss the attack in more detail, I'm going to say straight away that the attack appears to have been on a significantly lower scale than what we had been led to expect before. Now, that is, just to say, also something that we can take some comfort from, but it doesn't mean that events in the Middle East aren't still deteriorating and that we are not in a very dangerous situation, which is step by step becoming more dangerous still. But anyway, for the record, this was a less powerful attack, or so it seems, than had been flagged by some people in advance. First of all, it was not an attempted decapitation strike against the Iranian leadership. There'd been cause for that in Israel itself, but it seems that no specific attempt was made to go after the leadership of Iran, be it the political leadership, Ayatollah Khamenei and President Pezeshkian, and the other senior civilian officials in Iran, or the military leadership, the leadership of Iran's Ministry of Defense, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Iranian Tasnim news agency says that none of the IRGC's command centers was attacked at all. Secondly, there was no attack on any of Iran's nuclear facilities, and that all reports confirm, including the reports that are coming from Israel. And thirdly, there were no attacks on Iran's energy sector, or especially its oil and gas export sector. No attacks were made there, and the United States had apparently indicated that it did not support attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities or its energy sector, and in that it does appear that its wishes have prevailed. Now, there are inevitably very conflicting accounts about the scale of the Israeli attack and about the effectiveness of that attack. Now, the Israelis are saying that 100 aircraft were in the sky. If it is correct that US oil refueling aircraft KC-135s were deployed to the Middle East on a mass scale in advance of the attack. And by the way, the report said that they were, and to repeat again, those were reports that took place before the attack was launched. Well, it looks as if the United States facilitated this attack. It was involved. It appears to have provided air refueling facilities for the Israeli aircraft that were participating in the attack. All kinds of Israeli aircraft were used in the attack, including F-35 stealth aircraft. The attack also struck at positions in Iran itself, obviously, but also elsewhere outside Iran, with attacks apparently taking place against radar stations in Syria, which the Israelis believe, and the Americans believe, almost certainly correctly, form part of Iran's own early warning system. The Israelis say that all of their aircraft returned to base safely. They suffered no losses over the course of this attack. All of that, I'm sure, is true. The Iranians are not, as of this time, disputing it. And the missiles that were launched hit their targets. The Israelis, as of the time of making of this program, are not providing much more information than this. They're not giving damage assessment of the results of the strike, but they are leaning us towards thinking that the strike was mainly targeting Iran's air defense network. Though there are reports that a factory or a warehouse facility where Iranian ballistic missiles are either produced and stored was also attacked and destroyed as well. Now, the Iranians are giving a completely different account, as one would expect, and most of it, the best parts, the most authoritative discussion of the Iranian account, in my opinion, is provided by Iran's Tasnim news agency. Tasnim is not an official Iranian news agency. I've heard reports that it is closely linked to the IRGC, and whether it's official or not, it does seem to be kept pretty well informed about the thinking of the Iranian government and of the sort of information that the Iranian authorities want to publicize. To stress, this does not mean that what they are telling us is the objective reality. The reason Tasnim is the place to go is because that is where one gets the Iranian, the clearest account of the Iranian description of things, which I must quickly also hasten to say might very well be true. So what does the Tasnim news agency tell us? Well, they've published various reports. I'm going to quickly say, I'm not going to read the articles that appear, because if I started to do that, we would be here for a very long time. But anyway, we have a series of articles, one after the other. First says, source denies report of Israeli attacks on 20 locations in Iran. They say that an informed source told Tasnim that the Israeli military's claim that it has targeted 20 locations across in Iran is untrue. The number of locations targeted is significantly lower than that. We're also told by the Tasnim news agency, and this is, I believe, to be correct, that no Israeli aircraft crossed the Iranian border, that all Israeli attacks, all of these attacks, were carried out by missiles launched by the Israeli aircraft outside Iranian airspace. And they're also saying that Israel's claims that up to 100 Israeli military aircraft participated in the strike are not correct, and in the word of the source, Iran is seeking to overplay its weak attack. So that's what the Iranians are saying. They do admit that 2 of their people were killed over the course of the attack. And they're also saying that many of the explosions that were heard in Iranian cities, notably Tehran, were not the result of missile strikes, but were the result of the Iran's air defenses operating, of presumably the sonic booms and things of that kind as Iranian air defense missiles were launched, and of the impact of these missiles on the targets. And the Iranians are claiming that their air defense system was very effective in shooting down many of these targets. Though, again, we're not being provided the full picture. Now, I'm not in a position, obviously, to say which account is correct, whether it is true that 20 locations across Iran were attacked by the Israelis and that there were impacts in all of these places, which is what the Israelis are saying, or whether it was far fewer than this, which is what the Iranians are saying. I'm not in a position to say how effective or ineffective Iran's air defense system was. We will have to wait for the damage assessment reports, which presumably the Israelis are going to provide. And we will also, no doubt, in time, start to get satellite data. After the Iranian missile strike on Israel on the 1st of October, the Iranians made all kinds of claims. The Israelis made all sorts of counterclaims. Dribbles of satellite photos appeared initially. There was little doubt, in my opinion, that the Israeli authorities were trying for a time to limit the circulation of satellite images. But anyway, over time, more and more satellite images did appear. And gradually, after several weeks, it became possible to piece together a clearer picture of what the Iranian strike on Israel had achieved. And it became clear that, contrary to the impression that the Israelis and the Americans were giving, a very significant number of Iranian missiles got through, with a report in the Financial Times, backed by another report in the Daily Telegraph, telling us that at least 36 missiles managed to get through and strike Israel's giant Nevatim air base in the Negev desert. So it could very well be that we're going to go through the same process with this missile strike that Israel has just launched against Iran, that we're going to get more information over the next couple of days and weeks, which will give us a more complete and accurate picture of what exactly was destroyed and what damage was done. I, of course, have great difficulty seeing and understanding what the satellite imagery shows. So again, I'm going to have to rely, when it appears, on the expert commentary, which on this, thankfully, is outstanding. There are lots of people out there in many places who are very, very skilled in understanding what the satellite imagery says. But let's put all that aside and let's just draw some general conclusions. This was not a decapitation strike. And it was also a strike which did not target facilities essential to Iran. And the Iranians seem to be pleased with that outcome, and they're going out of their way to convey a sense of normality in their country. They're saying that life in Iran is going on as normal. They were saying that their airports were operating throughout the strike, the time when the strike was taking place. So, surprisingly, there are also reports that after the strike had ended, they closed the airports down. The Israelis, for their part, are saying that the strike is over, that this was not the first in a wave of strikes that the Israelis might have launched. And just before I made this program, I saw a report which, to be clear, I saw on a Russian Telegram channel, but I suspect it is true, that Iran is communicating to Israel through third parties that they do not intend, that they do not feel under any pressure to retaliate to this strike. If this is all that Israel does, Iran will leave it at this. They demonstrated, the Iranians demonstrated their own deterrent power with their missile strike on the 1st of October, and the Israeli counterstrike was not such that they feel that they need to act further in order to emphasize or re-emphasize their own deterrent capability. And there are reports, I must admit, coming again from that same Russian Telegram channel, but there were reports that the United States is now also telling Israel that the moment has now come to draw a line under this whole affair. If this is correct, then on a much more powerful and more dangerous scale, this is a repeat of what happened in April. The Israelis conducted an attack on the Iranian embassy building in Damascus. The Iranians conducted a missile strike on Israel. They telegraphed the fact hours in advance to the United States. They conducted the attack in a manner that essentially showed that the Iranians were pulling their punches. The Israelis launched a counterstrike. There is some evidence that that Israeli counterstrike was rather more powerful than had been indicated in the immediate hours after it took place, but it was not so powerful that the Iranians felt under an obligation to respond. And for a few weeks, for a few months, the situation appeared to calm down. So it looks as if we are at something like that same point, but at a much more dangerous level of mutual action. The Iranian strike on the 1st of October was much more powerful than the Iranian strike that took place in April, and the Israeli strike that has just happened was obviously on a completely different scale from the one that took place in April as well. Now, why did we get here? There were lots of reports in Israel that they were going to go for a decapitation strike. The Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, said that the Israeli attack would be powerful, precise, and surprising. The Iranians deny that it was surprising. They say that they were given a pre-warning before the strike took place. I'm going to discuss shortly where some of these warnings and messages might be coming from that are being exchanged between the Israelis and the Iranians in a moment. But anyway, the Iranians say that it was not a surprising strike at all. And I have to say, even putting aside the question of whether the Iranians were told in advance about the strike, the fact is that there's been so much commentary about the strike over the last couple of weeks that it is inconceivable that the Iranians were taken by surprise to any significant degree. As to how precise this strike was, I'm going to wait until we get the satellite imagery. But as to it being powerful, I've already said that it looks altogether less powerful than many of us had anticipated. So what happened? Why did the Israelis scale it down, because I have no doubt that they did scale it down. I am going to engage now in a little speculation, but I think this is well-informed speculation. Just to say, I think all the indications are that the Israelis, Prime Minister Netanyahu, were looking for a major fight with Iran. I think this has been an ongoing thing since April, since the attack on the embassy building in Damascus. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu telegraphed his intentions very clearly when he went to the United States in August and when he addressed Congress. And he did the same thing a few weeks ago when he went to the United Nations. I think Israeli moves, the attacks on Hezbollah, the assassination of Hezbollah leaders, the assassination of Hamas leaders, the general pattern of escalation conducted by Israel, all of that points clearly to a Israeli intention to engage in a major confrontation with Iran. In the preceding weeks, we've had lots of commentary to the same effect from the Israeli media, from Israeli political leaders. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Israeli cabinet minister, has been talking about the opportunity Israel has to cut off the head of the snake, referring to Iran itself. There have been calls in Israel for a decapitation strike. All the evidence is, or at least as far as I'm concerned, all the evidence is that we were moving towards a major attack by Israel against Iran. And then, about a week ago, something happened. And that something was that two important classified documents were published in the United States. And those documents apparently outlined Israeli preparations for its strike against Iran. Now, since these documents are classified, and since there are now legal issues highlighted by all kinds of court cases around the world about the risks of looking at classified documents, I'm going to say this openly, I've not read those documents, I've not looked at them, I've not drawn any assessments about them. But what I have done is I have read the commentaries made by people who understand these matters and who have read these documents and whom I consider to be reliable. And the overall conclusion which I draw from this is that the two documents describe preparations for an Israeli strike on Iran, an order of magnitude more powerful than the one we have just witnessed, and one which was clearly aimed at conducting a decapitation strike against Iran's leaders. And I ought to say that the certain comments by Prime Minister Netanyahu, the fact that he was saying that the Iranian people would be liberated from the regime that oppresses them, those weren't his exact words, but that is essentially what he was saying. Certain comments by Prime Minister Netanyahu also seem to me to corroborate the view that what was initially planned by the Israelis was indeed a decapitation strike on a much bigger scale than the strike that we have just seen. So what happened, or so it seems to me, was this. Apparently these documents were leaked in the United States. The documents in question appear to have been highly classified. Now, a year and a half ago, I remember that there were all kinds of documents which outlined the preparations for Ukraine's 2023 offensive, and they too were highly classified, And for a while, I assumed that someone who was clearly opposed to the conduct of that offensive in the United States had leaked those documents, perhaps in a desperate attempt to get the whole thing called off. But it turned out that the documents were actually leaked by a young soldier for all kinds of personal reasons. At least that's the story we've been told. I've never been entirely convinced by that, but anyway, that is the story we have been told. But I'm going to go back to my assumption this time, that these documents were leaked by somebody fairly senior, or a decision was made by someone fairly senior in the United States government to leak these documents. I am not going to speculate as to who that person might have been, or to which department of the United States government that person, whoever he or she was, belonged to. But the objective was to force the Israelis to call off the strike. In other words, someone in the United States was unhappy about the scale of the Israeli plans and the objective behind them. And the leak achieved its effect. The Israelis were thrown off balance. They couldn't conduct the strike because, in effect, so many of the details had been published. And that enabled the more moderate voices, if that's the right word, in the United States to come back and twist the arm of the Israelis and to get them to scale down substantially what it was that they were intending to do. Now, one person clearly was not involved in this leak, and that was the President of the United States. He was presumably fully informed of the Israeli plans, but the reports are saying that he was, and these reports are appearing in the American media, the reports are saying that he was absolutely furious by the leak of these reports, of these documents, which strongly suggests to me that the President of the United States, for all the difficult exchanges he's had with Prime Minister Netanyahu, for all his attempts supposedly to get Prime Minister Netanyahu to slow down, for all the stories we've been hearing about his disagreement with many of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to do. On the contrary, if all this information, if these speculations that I'm making are true, then the President of the United States, far from being a force of restraint, was in fact happy to endorse, or maybe not happy, but was endorsing what the Israelis were seeking to do, was endorsing a decapitation strike against Iran, and was furious when someone, and it might have been more than one person, in fact, I'm going to suggest that it undoubtedly was many more than just one person, took the decision to put a spoke in the wheel and sabotage the whole plan. And there it is, a decapitation strike that was called off, probably at the last moment, probably shortly before it was intended to take place, and a president who is furious about it, but paving the way to a situation where we might have a potential de-escalation, at least briefly, not in the overall situation in the Middle East, but in this intense period of tension between Israel and Iran. So there we are. That's my own sense of this. Now, there's a number of conclusions to draw. First of all, if my speculations are correct, and one must be always very careful because one shouldn't pile one if upon another, but I'm going to do it in this case. If my speculations are correct, then it is confirmation that the President of the United States no longer exercises any authority at all within the United States government. He comes up with plans. His plans lean always towards escalation because that is the nature of his personality and of his temperament. But whenever that happens, or at least for the moment, others in his government move to undermine what he is doing. I am going to suggest that this was the case with the entire project for conducting missile strikes deep inside Russia. My own strong impression is that the president himself, certainly his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, were fully supportive of that idea. Then all kinds of media reports started to appear about how people within the security and defense establishment were becoming exasperated at the president's inability to adhere to his own red lines. The Pentagon made it absolutely clear that it strongly opposed this whole idea of missile strikes deep inside Russia. The Pentagon, in effect, torpedoed the whole plan, with the result that when Zelensky and Starmer came to Washington to try to get approval for that plan, they found stony-faced and angry Americans probably having argued bitterly with each other about this very thing, but with the Americans determined to kick the can down the road, first to the Ramstein conference on the 12th of October, and of course that was then called off as well. So that was one example of the president, in my opinion, probably willing to embrace escalation, but being stopped just before he could do it. And the same, it seems to me, has played out here. An Israeli plan to move forward with a decapitation strike against the Iranian leaders, also called off at the last moment because someone within the US government decided that this was unacceptable, that the risks of an all-out war between Israel and Iran were too high because of the enormous risks to the state of the world economy, from potential disruptions to the oil trade, of risks to the long-term security of American troops in the Middle East, security of the entire Middle East region. All of these things were too high. Opinions, by the way, which I should make clear again, I wholly share. So, are we supposed to go away and feel happy about all of this? Is this something which gives us grounds for optimism? Well, if you've just been listening to what I've been saying, you might think that that is my view, but on the contrary, it is not. The fact is, we are now perhaps no longer trundling with quite the same speed towards a confrontation between Iran and Israel as I was fearful a couple of days or weeks ago. But we are still very close, or dangerously close, to exactly that position. Because, briefly, red lines have now been crossed. Critically important red lines have now been crossed. The Iranians have conducted 2 missile strikes against Iran. The second missile strike was far from a token strike. It demonstrated that Iran has the ability and the will to target places in Iran and to cause real damage to Israeli facilities. Israel has gone much further. It has not only assassinated people like the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran itself, but it has now launched a major missile strike on Iran, something it has never done before. This has been a major crossing of a red line. From this moment on, crossing that red line again is going to become much easier. For the moment, there are still some restraints there, but the restraints are fraying. The Israelis are continuing their pattern of escalation. The Iranians are demonstrating their power and their resilience. The Americans are clearly nervous, but the fact remains, to say it again, that the most important red lines have now been crossed. These are not going to be the last attacks that Israel and Iran are going to launch against each other. There will be more, and to be absolutely clear, the next attacks will be more powerful than the ones we have just seen this October, just as the attacks that have taken place, the mutual attacks that have taken place this October, were orders of magnitude more powerful than the attacks that took place in April. We are indeed heading, perhaps more slowly, but we are still heading towards that all-out clash, that tremendous battle, which I've been fearing for some time, and which only a new administration in Washington, much more firmly led than the current one, is in any position, would be in any position to stop and slow down. If my analysis is correct, which I suspect, by the way, it is, that the worst has been averted because of some quick footwork by some people within the Washington bureaucracy who have deliberately leaked classified documents onto the internet. Well, that is no reassurance, because it shows that the political will and the ability to exercise restraint through the correct, conventional, mainstream means of diplomacy are no longer there in the United States, and they're unlikely to be there until the new president takes office in January. So that's something I wanted to say. One should take very limited comfort from the limited nature of this exchange, if one should take any comfort at all. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to discuss briefly is I said that I thought that it would be important just to say a few things about who was transferring the messages backwards and forwards. And, well, there have been various mediating bodies. There's the government of Qatar, which has been conveying messages between Iran and Israel and the United States, with these Americans passing on messages to the Israelis. That back channel has existed for some time, as we know. There have no doubt been other channels through the Swiss as well. But I've discussed in previous programs that it has seemed to me that ever so quietly the shadow of Moscow has been falling on the Middle East, and it is getting deeper. Now, it's not been widely reported, but there is at the moment a Russian delegation in Israel. There's been very little said about it. I don't know its exact composition. The story is that they're there to try to facilitate negotiations for the release of the hostages in Gaza. President Putin himself, over the course of his press conference in Kazan at the BRICS summit, and in other comments, went out of his way to speak about the friendly relations and respectful relations that Russia has with both Israel and Iran. He did make clear that the relations between Iran and Russia are allied relations. It was an important point that he made, squirreled into the comments he made over the course of that press conference. Of course, relations between Russia and Israel are not allied. But anyway, he did speak sympathetically of the Israelis. He said, he went out of his way to say that Israel has a right not to be exposed to terrorist attacks, for example. Putin also said many other things. He spoke about the need to try and resolve the crisis in the Middle East by looking at the root causes of the problem, which is the absence of a Palestinian state. He again seemed to lend support to ideas for setting up a peace conference to try and chart a way forward towards achieving that. He did give an impression that Russia might be prepared to fulfill some sort of, I won't say exactly mediation role, but anyway, a role as some kind of honest broker between Russia, between Iran and the various other parties and Israel. And he went out of his way to say that it is important to maintain contacts with all parties involved, and he pointedly included Israel in that. So we have a Russian delegation in Israel, and I wonder whether what is now happening is that the Iranians and the Israelis are now communicating directly with each other through the Russians. In other words, we are no longer having to go through this complex process of the Iranians saying something to the Qataris, who pass it on to the Americans, who then pass it on to the Israelis. I'm not saying that doesn't still continue. I'm not suggesting that other mediation channels like the Swiss don't exist as well. But I wonder whether the Russians aren't playing a much more active role now. Putin's words, as, by the way, the Indian media seem to notice, rather suggest that. And again, all of this, the velvet glove, if you like, is to some extent also backed by a mailed fist. The Russians have also given very strong warnings to the Israelis that, yes, they know all about Israeli attacks on Iranian radar stations in Syria and all of that, but the Israelis need to be careful. They mustn't even think about attacking the facilities of Russia's own Khmeimim air base or strike at any Russian military installations at Iran. As I discussed some programs ago, the official Russian news agency TASS provided some clue as to the nature of that Russian warning. And the Russians, of course, are not only involved with the Iranians, but they are regular contact with them. Putin met Pezeshkian in Kazan just a week after he met Pezeshkian in Ashgabat. There are many reports that the Russians are on the ground in Tehran, as of course they are in Syria. It's highly likely that the Russians are keeping track of the movement of Israeli aircraft. Maybe the Israelis passed on a warning through their various subterranean channels to the Iranians that the attack was coming. Maybe the Americans did. but quite plausibly, the Russians did so as well. And of course, the Russians wouldn't need to have been informed about an Israeli attack by the Israelis, because their systems, their radar systems, including the ones they have in Syria, would be fully adequate to keeping track of what the Israelis are doing and informing the Iranians about it. I remember reading about 5 years ago an article in the Israeli media which said that the Russian radar systems in Syria at the Khmeimim air base are sufficiently powerful and sophisticated so that the Russians are able to track the takeoff of any single Israeli aircraft from any Israeli airbase. I remember reading that at the time, and I have to say, it did make my eyes shoot up. So anyway, they are perhaps there. The Russians are perhaps playing a role. They may be acting as a factor for restraint. The Iranian attack, the demonstration of Iranian capabilities on the 1st of October is acting as a restraint. But to repeat again, the key red line has now been crossed. Both Iran and Israel have demonstrated their ability to launch strikes upon each other and their will to do so, and that remains a very dangerous thing for overall developments in the Middle East. Meanwhile, the various wars continue. The war in South Lebanon continues. The fighting there continues. Hamas continues to rain down its rockets on Israel. That goes on every single day. Thousands of Israelis in northern Israel are still unable to return to their homes. There's lots of very conflicting reports about what is actually going on the battle lines in South Lebanon. From what I can see, if the Israelis are making any progress at all, it is highly incremental. I've read reports. These, of course, come from Iranian sources, so, I don't want to put a huge amount of weight on them, but they may be true, that the massive Israeli bombing raids have, of course, done massive damage to Iran's, to Hezbollah's civilian leadership, to Hezbollah Secretary Generals. Nasrallah and Safieddin have been killed in quick succession. But Hezbollah's military capabilities have been barely dented. I've seen film of Hezbollah missiles being launched from underground silos in Lebanon. It looks as if, or it may seem, or at least these pictures are intended to convey the appearance that the tunnel and bunker network created by Hezbollah is effectively undamaged, and that Israeli attacks on residential areas in southern Beirut are basically more demonstrative now, are basically expressions of frustration. They're incredibly brutal acts of frustration, if that is so, rather than intended to achieve any overall military result, just say. And in Gaza, of course, the fighting there continues as well, despite the death in fighting of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader. The fighting in Gaza continues. Hamas is still there. It's still able to operate. It doesn't look as if these wars are moving forward to any sort of conclusion. I'm going to finish this run-up of the situation in the Middle East by simply repeating again the point I have made many times before. that, in my opinion, Israel is in a dead end. It's in a cul-de-sac. In fact, that's perhaps putting it too generously. I think Israel is, instead of making its own position better, as it appears to believe, it is making its situation worse. It is caught up in two attrition wars in Lebanon and Gaza, neither of which, so far as I can see, are going well in military terms. It's involved in exchanges of missile strikes with the Houthis in Yemen, where Israel has been able to achieve nothing. The moral damage caused by the tens of thousands of civilians that have been killed has been appalling. Putin, by the way, alluded to that too. And looming over everything, there is now the confrontation with Iran, and the Iranians have demonstrated the power of their capabilities, and the Israelis, for the moment, have been obliged to pull their punches. I see no sign of it at the moment, but the need in its own interests for Israel to change tack, to return to a negotiation and diplomatic track, would appear to be imperative. And I strongly suspect that that is what that Russian delegation in Israel is also trying to convey. Anyway, that's the end of my discussion about the situation in the Middle East. Now, I'm going to proceed now to discuss two other issues. Firstly, I'd like to turn to this major story that many people have been talking about, the Chinese-Indian border agreement. As I've said in one of my previous programs, this was certainly a diplomatic breakthrough of a kind, in that it has generally calmed the situation between India and China, enabling what appears to have been a successful summit meeting to take place between Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Kazan. It is not the diplomatic resolution of all the many accumulated issues which exist between China and India. There are still major disputes about territory and the border, which, as I said, will take years, if not decades, of earnest, good faith diplomacy to resolve. But nobody was aiming for something like that over the last couple of weeks. But there is one topic that I do want to discuss, because I've seen quite a number of commentaries now, including one in Asia Times by an Indian commentator, another by Andrew Karibko, a very interesting geopolitical analyst. Anyway, what they're all saying, what these people are saying, is that this Indian-Chinese rapprochement is a product of the deterioration of India's relations with the United States. That the Indians have become frustrated and disillusioned with American policy, that they feel that the Americans have been refusing to take India's concerns seriously, that expectations of massive investment by the United States in the Indian economy have been disappointed, that the Indian government has been annoyed by the steps taken by the United States and Canada to put pressure on India with respect to its treatment of the Sikhs in the Punjab, and in connection with India's own actions or alleged actions against Sikh separatist leaders, principally in Canada. Now, I think that there is some truth to this. I do think that the Indian government has for some time gradually started to understand that the relationship between India and the United States was never going to be fully stabilized, because American demands on India were so unbalanced, and because the expected massive investment into India by American companies has never come. So I think that there is some truth to that. But I do think that these commentaries also underestimate the sophistication of Indian foreign policy. I have never been of the view that India had seriously decided to ally itself with the United States. I think this is a point which Americans especially need to understand. I think that certainly the Indian government wanted good relations with the United States. Why wouldn't it? But I don't think that the intention in Delhi, whether under the Manmohan Singh government that was in power in India roughly a decade ago, or under the current Modi government, ever conceived of a straightforward alliance between India and the United States against China, which is what a lot of people in the United States wanted. After all, India has always been a full member of the BRICS. It's been heavily engaged in all of the processes of BRICS construction. It's never at any point in time retreated on that. And as we have seen over the last few years, India, both under the Manmohan Singh government and under the Modi government, has worked to build and develop a very close relationship indeed with Russia, a relationship which both of these governments, perhaps even more the Modi government than the Manmohan Singh government, have placed huge weight upon. My own view is that India perceives itself as an independent, sovereign state, as an emerging great power, perhaps as an emerging superpower. It also does not want an all-out war with China, and it wants at some point to sort out its problems with China. In fact, Indian diplomats have said this to me, or at least said this in discussions which I've been involved in. A former Indian ambassador to Moscow made exactly this point to Glenn Deason and myself in a long program that we did with him. Anyway, given, however, that India has a fraught relationship with China, and given that China is by far the richer and more powerful country, with a much more powerful armed forces, far stronger industries, and much more ability to conduct major investments, much greater financial firepower. It's completely understandable that any Indian government, even if it wants to improve relations with China, which I think the current Indian government, all Indian governments basically do, would seek leverage over China by hedging with third parties. And that, I think, is what India has been doing. They've developed their relationship with Russia, obviously. They know that the Russians have a good relationship with China, but they also know that the Russians are an independent power, so they want good relations with the Russians, partly for that reason. And of course, they also want good relations with the United States, because when they meet with the Chinese, they're not in that sort of situation, meeting in a situation where the Chinese can say to themselves, well, the Indians don't have good relations with the Americans, they don't have good relations with the Russians, we can steamroll right over them because we're so much stronger than they are, we can clear up on the border if the Indians say no to us. The Indians don't want to be put in that kind of situation. So that's why they maintain these relations with these other countries as well. And it's because India has that kind of leverage that they've been able to reach the kind of agreements on the border with the Chinese that they just have. Now, the Chinese, whose conduct of foreign policy is every bit as sophisticated as India's is, understand that perfectly well. And that is why, though China would obviously prefer it if India did not go all the way with the United States, and China would also prefer it if India didn't have any good relations with the United States, provided the relations between India and the United States are at the level that we have seen in the past, in the recent past. The Chinese are not going to be too alarmed about it. These two great nations are maneuvering around each other. Step by step, they are building up their relationships. They're doing so through the BRICS. They're doing so through the various other forums that they cooperate and work with together. They have multiple contacts at many levels. The Chinese, unlike the Americans, not only have the ability, but also the wish to invest heavily in the Indian economy. And India, which absolutely needs investment, would probably welcome that. My own view is that this agreement over the border was something completely independent of India's problems with the United States. The Indians were heading in that direction anyway. The recent problems that have arisen between India and the United States are precisely because the Americans have become frustrated with India. They're alarmed because the Indians maintain their strong relationship with Russia, and they're alarmed because the Indians have been quietly working to improve their relations with the Chinese. And that is why we have all the problems with the Sikhs and all of these issues with the Sikhs and all of those other issues being flagged in the West in the way that they are. So that's what I wanted to say about this. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that I've also seen a number of narratives spreading about the BRICS and the meeting in Kazan. There are those who say that this is the end tomorrow of the dollar and its hegemony. Well, I think that is wildly overstated. What we got out of the BRICS states was a very interesting set of blueprints, but the devil is in the detail. It's going to take a long time for all of this to be sorted out. It'll be before it will take at least to the 2030s before all the things that we saw happen in Kazan come fully into place, just to say. But there is also an alternative view, which I've also seen, which is that ultimately this isn't that important. The only importance of this meeting in Kazan is in its demonstration that the Russians are not isolated, that all of these leaders there are prepared to go to Russia and meet with Putin, and that the attempt by the West to isolate Russia has been unsuccessful. Well, that, of course, is indisputably true, but that in all other respects, BRICS remains a talking shop, and not that all of these plans that have been announced or talked about, they remain just so much pie in the sky. Well, about that, I don't agree either, and I want to make this clear. I think that this greatly underestimates the events as they are developing. I think that the blueprints are for real. I think that though it will not be before the 2030s before we see fruition in terms of all of them. It will be a lot sooner than that before we start to see actual changes begin to take shape, just saying. And in the meantime, I mean, when I say changes, I'm guessing about 2 to 3 years, we will start to see things like BRICS Pay and BRICS Clear and BRICS Bridge, all these different bits of the financial architecture starting to appear. After all, digital currencies, which is what all this is being built around, are just round the corner. So that's not so far away. But of course, there's also the other aspect of this, which is that alongside the construction of the architecture, we have the process of BRICS expansion, and 13 countries have now been given associate membership, and it is very interesting to see which they are. The list is Turkey, Kazakhstan. A lot of people were talking about Kazakhstan, that it hadn't participated, that it wasn't attending the BRICS summit meeting. Well, as I said, it did attend the BRICS summit meeting, and there we are. It is now a BRICS associate state, partner state. Uzbekistan, Algeria, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Vietnam. So note a couple of things from this list. Turkey is now clearly working to join the BRICS. It's achieved associate membership. Erdogan and Putin had lengthy discussions about setting up a clearing system between Turkey and Russia to bypass Western financial sanctions. That's apparently going to be brought into place within the next few months, which will help unblock certain problems with trade, mutual trade, that American secondary sanctions have been creating. So just to say, that is a big step. I wonder how long, given that Turkey is now focusing on the BRICS, how long it will be before Turkey starts to reconsider its NATO membership. Erdogan, for the moment, is saying that, Turkey can both walk and chew gum at the same time. It can join the BRICS and be a member of NATO at one and the same time. I wonder whether that is really true. just to say, clearly, Erdogan's focus, however, is more on BRICS than NATO. And with Turkey moving towards the BRICS, I think we can say conclusively that Turkey's historic progress towards Europe, it made its first bid for EU membership. Of course, it was the European Economic Community in those days, I believe all the way back in 1964. Well, that has now fallen completely by the wayside, or so it seems. So anyway, Turkey moving towards the BRICS. Of course, if Turkey leaves NATO, joins the BRICS, I've discussed in many places, this will fundamentally change the whole geometry of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and of course, it would make the Black Sea a BRICS lake. We'll come to that in a moment. But anyway, Turkey. And then Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Now, these are the two biggest Central Asian powers, former Soviet republics. They're both becoming BRICS member states, both allies of China and Russia. They've both been in close contact with the Russians at the moment. Kazakhstan is a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization and of the Eurasian Economic Union. Uzbekistan, for the moment, is not, but perhaps it's going to head in that direction before long too. So these are the two biggest countries by far in former Soviet Central Asia, and they're joining the BRICS. Elsewhere, note the strong representation now of Southeast Asian states. The countries of ASEAN are moving towards BRICS in what is starting to look like a bloc. Indonesia, economic powerhouse, huge country, immensely diverse country. Their president-elect is visited Moscow a couple of weeks ago. Their their current president, excellent relations with both China and Russia. And by the way, someone who's had a very friendly meeting with none other than Professor John Mearsheimer, who turns up from time to time on our programs on the Duran, just saying. So Indonesia, Malaysia, another economic powerhouse, major producer of chips, I believe still the world's biggest producer of rubber, a thriving and vibrant economy, as Alex Cristoforo and I discovered when we were in Kuala Lumpur a couple of weeks ago. Thailand and Vietnam. Vietnam, a country that the United States has courted, tried to make an ally against China, and it is going along with the other ASEAN countries. It is heading towards BRICS. And we have one more Arab country, but it's an important one, which is Algeria, major oil producer. It wanted to join BRICS last year, wasn't included, got rather upset about the fact, but it's now been given associate membership. So its membership is back on track. So Algeria, but now we have the UAE and Egypt, full BRICS states. Uncertainty about what Saudi Arabia is doing, but the Saudis were present. They did participate in the BRICS meeting in Kazan. They're obviously under lots of pressure, but the Arab states also starting to work to move towards BRICS, and African countries. So South Africa and Ethiopia, already members of BRICS, and they're now going to be joined by Uganda and Nigeria as well. I think I'm right in saying that with Nigeria joining, three of the big four in Africa, the big four are South Africa, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. 3 out of the big four will be members. The DRC is not yet in a position to do that because, unfortunately, it is still caught up in difficult conflicts and wars. But Nigeria joining, and another important African country, Uganda, joining as well. And 2 Latin American states joining. Bolivia, probably lobbied for by Brazil. The Brazilians want more Latin American representation in BRICS. President Maduro arrived at the BRICS summit. He apparently wanted to join BRICS. The Brazilians blocked it. That is well known. There's no dispute about that. But anyway, Bolivia joined instead. This might have been a decision made at the last moment because the Brazilian president arrived very hurriedly. Was Bolivia an important producer of valuable minerals, I believe a lot of lithium there, and Cuba, going through a very, very difficult economic crisis at the moment. The Russians, as I said, have a strong interest in Cuba. It seemed last year that Russian investment was going to pour into Cuba. I suspect that that was thrown into disarray by the sanctions that were imposed by the Western powers on the Russian oil and finance trade. But now Cuba is being offered a lifeline through the BRICS. So we could see the process continuing. And the important thing to see is that all of the key regions of the world, they're now starting to converge on the BRICS. If I was in Washington or London, the region that would alarm me most is Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, Uganda, and Vietnam. Sorry, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, all joining the BRICS together. And of course, all this rounded out with Belarus, firm Russian ally. They're now a BRICS associate member as well. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the BRICS. There's been much said about this. I think I'm now going to return to the situation in Ukraine. And here I'm going to say that the most dramatic events are happening. And they're all happening on the battle lines. Events are moving at blistering speed. It is very, very difficult now to keep full track on what is going on. But the main area of the Russian advance is in this great battle that's been taking place from Pokrovsk in the north to Ugledar in the south. I've already said that, in my opinion, this must be understood as part of one great epic battle, the biggest in the war. And all the indications are that it is now, this battle is now coming to an end with a clear-cut Russian victory and a disastrous outcome for Ukraine. The Ukrainian Telegram channel, Resident, is reporting that the local commanders, the local Ukrainian commanders in this area, have completely lost confidence in Syrsky, the overall military chief, that they're no longer obeying his orders, that in many cases that they are retreating, ignoring commands to stand that are coming from Syrsky, and presumably defying any decisions by Syrsky to sack them. There are, in addition, multiple reports that Ukrainian soldiers themselves, military units themselves, are retreating, sometimes without orders. So it's difficult to describe simply what is going on in a battle taking place over this huge territory, but I'm going to try and do so as quickly as I can. Briefly, first of all, intense battles are taking place north of Ugledar. The Russians astonished everybody by launching an attack from the village of Zolota Niva. They advanced north towards another village called Shakhtarske. There's uncertainties as to what exactly is taking place in that village of Shakhtarske. But anyway, they've advanced to that village. Shakhtarske lies west of the other village of Novoukrainka, which the Russians, interestingly, have not attacked up to this point. It's been pointed out that if the Russians capture Shakhtarske, Novoukrainka is in effect surrounded, and the Russians apparently have already sent or attempted to send reconnaissance groups from the area close to Shakhtarske towards Velika Novosilka. Further to the west, they've tried to send reconnaissance troops towards Velika Novosilka, probing the defenses of that key village that the Ukrainians control in western Donbass, which holds together their positions east of the great city of Zaporozhye. The Russians are probing the defenses of Velika Novosilka from the northwest. The point is that apparently Velika Novosilka is heavily fortified along its southern perimeter, but that there are no strong defenses in the north because the Ukrainians never imagined that a Russian attack would come from that direction. So the Russians attacking Shakhtorsk, preparing perhaps to attack Velika Novosilka, and lots of reports now that the Russians have begun a storming operation of Bogoyavlenka itself. Lots of confusing reports, lots of pictures of Bogoyavlenka being heavily bombed. There are reports that the Russians have entered Bogoyavlenka. It's difficult to know what exactly is taking place. But the attack on Bogoyavlenka is apparently on an enormous scale. And I think we can now start to see that the purpose of the attacks on those four villages, Katerinovka, Antonovka, Yelizavetka, Ilivka, they're all working. The Russians, the ultimate objective of the Russians in attacking all of these places, Shakhtorsk, Novoukrainka, it's been pointed out that the Russians capture Shakhtorsk and Bogoyavlenka. The Ukrainians will have to pull out of Novoukrainka or first face encirclement there. Is that the Russian objective ultimately is to advance northwards towards Kurakovo, to encircle Kurakovo from the south, even as the Russians are pressing on Kurakovo from the north. Anyway, it is an epic battle that is apparently taking place. And further north, the battle becomes more epic still. So early this morning, there was reports that the Russians have captured one of the four villages where the Ukrainians were surrounded, the villages of Zoryania, Kurachovka, Alexandropil, and Vovchenka. Over the last couple of days, there's been reports that the Russians have captured the village of Izmailivka, which is one of the villages somewhat to the north of this cluster. There are, in my previous program, I said that it appeared that Girnik had been captured by the Russians. That was premature, but in a way, the information that we're now getting is that the situation for the Ukrainians would have been better if Girnik had been simply captured. Because it seems what happened was that a Ukrainian unit in Girnik retreated without orders. The men were not able to withstand the Russians in Girnik. So not only is most of Girnik under Russian control, but apparently there is a sizable force of Ukrainians, what I mean by sizable, a couple of hundred troops who are essentially now surrounded in Girnik with no prospect or hope of escape or of a relief. Anyway, this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry apparently confirmed that another of these villages, this place which has been a pocket, Alexandropil, has fallen, that the Russians have captured Alexandropil. And incredibly, and I if this is true, the report is astonishing, but incredibly, there are also reports that Russian troops have now broken through and advanced westwards from Alexandropil, skirting the villages of Kurachovka and Vovchenka, which remain under Ukrainian control, and have captured, or at least are attacking, the village of Ilinka, which is on the northern banks of the Kurakovo Reservoir. Now, it could also be that with the Russians having captured Izmailovka and apparently captured at least half of another village called Novoselidivka, which lies to the west of Izmailovka, that the Russians have also advanced on Ilinka from the north. But if that is the case, then we are absolutely talking about a cauldron for the Ukrainian troops, of what's left of the Ukrainian troops in these 4 villages. And to be blunt, I think a surrender by the Ukrainians in these 4 villages is absolutely something that they should be considering doing as quickly as possible. But there's other reports as well which speak of the Russians having advanced westwards from the village of Tsukurinye, which they captured some days ago. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed the capture of Tsukurinye, but just saying. But the Russians have advanced west and have now reached another village called Novodmitrivka, and apparently they are preparing to push to capture Novodmitrivka, which is on the main road from Selidovo to Kurakovo, skirting the western bank of the Kurakovo Reservoir. So, as I said, events appear to be moving incredibly fast. And if we talk about Selidovo itself, well, in my previous program, I said that there were reports claiming that 95% of Selidovo had been captured by the Russians. Well, that turned out to be premature. But again, it might have been better for the Ukrainians if it had actually been true, because it might have meant that the Ukrainians were withdrawing from Selidovo, whereas in fact the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Selidovo is actually far worse. First things to say is that the TASS news agency is reporting that the Ukrainians are in fact still trying to conduct withdrawals from Selidovo. And this was the report. This was what the so-called security services told TASS. The enemy does not cease the attempts to save the remnants of the military personnel at the Selidovo formation, ramping up the pace of fleeing from the city. They come out in groups along the roads that are subjected to shelling, losing significant numbers of people there. But anyway, we've now had definite film which confirms that the Russians absolutely do now control the major slag heap. They control the slag heap and coal mine to the northeast of Selidovo. They appear to have captured the entire eastern part of this small town. They've also captured the whole southern part of this small town. There are multiple reports that Ukrainian troops are cut off in various places within Selidovo itself. And there are also reports that the Russians are in Vishnevo, the village to the west of Selidovo, and that they in effect control all of the main roads. This is turning into a disaster. Selidovo is becoming a disaster for Ukraine on the scale of Vuhledar. I suspect at the very least similar numbers of troops, Ukrainian troops, are involved, and they are being cut off and destroyed by the Russians. Now, the Military Summary Channel and others has been discussing at enormous length battles that are taking place for a coal mine and slag heap west of the other town of Novogorodivka that the Russians captured some weeks ago. They say that there's fighting going on for this slag heap, Novogorodivka the third. All I will say is, it seems as if this coal mine and slag heap is surrounded on three sides by the Russians, trying to hold on to this place. It strikes me as folly, but it seems that this is what the Ukrainian command is trying to do. It looks as if, as I said, we're heading for a total collapse there as well. Anyway, this is the main battle in the Ukraine war. It's the biggest battle that has been fought in the war up to now. It will end when the main prize, Pokrovsk itself, falls under Russian control. But already Ukrainian commanders are on the ground are anticipating that, and they're urgently calling for defenses to be created along the Dnieper to protect the city of Dnipro from what they foresee will be the Russian offensive, which will start to happen as soon as Pokrovsk falls. And I would add that a Russian offensive on Zaporozhye, the other city just south of Dnipro, the other great city south of Dnipro on the Dnieper River, that offensive will also almost certainly begin after the Russians have captured the village of the small town of Velika Novosilka and Orechov. And as we saw, the Russians have already made the first probing attacks over the last 24 hours towards Velika Novosilka from the northwest. So a catastrophic situation, one which I don't think the Ukrainians have any real understanding of, the elite political leadership has any real understanding of. Across the rest of the battle lines, things seem to be grinding on in the way that they are. There's lots of claims that the Ukrainians are still in control of the Zabalka micro-district in Toretsk all along. I'm not going to waste time discussing that. It seems to me that the outcome of the Battle of Toretsk has already been decided to a great effect. And if the Ukrainians are holding in some places, it's not going to make in the long run any difference. Fewer reports from Chasov Yar and Siversk recently. Group of forces north continuing to claim major advances in the Kursk region. And Zelensky still sending troops there. And reports that Ukrainian commanders elsewhere, but particularly in this great battle in southwestern Donbass, are starting to feel betrayed. They're feeling that Zelensky and Syrski are prioritizing the pointless battle in Kursk over this existentially important battle that is now playing out in the south near the Dnieper. Well, signs of negotiation, nowhere to be seen. The one thing we know is that Zelensky has just refused a visa to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. He's throwing a hissy fit because Guterres attended the Kazan meeting. And apparently he's furious about that. Zelensky's furious about that. And for that reason, he won't talk to the UN. I'm going to discuss in more detail such diplomacy as there is over Ukraine, hardly any in my opinion, in my next program. But anyway, another critical day. Events in the Middle East, very dangerous, becoming more dangerous still. A collapse in Ukraine, and I think this is not an overstatement of things. I read an article somewhere, it was in Asia Times, which spoke about the Ukrainian army being in the position that the German army was in January 1945. And I think that is starting to bring us somewhere close to the truth. Anyway, all of that going on. The BRICS Summit 2024 is turning into a hugely important year. And of course, we still have the American elections to come. But this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.